Right. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to this. I think our first in the newly revamped chemical engineering, chemical and biological engineering seminar series. It's a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Malin Johansson from Uppsala, University of Uppsala in Sweden, where I asked her what her formal job title is, and she said docent, and so I had to get Google Translate out, which roughly translates to associate prof or researcher, where she's been working on perovskite materials for solar cell applications for a number of years. She's here visiting in Sheffield. She's for a total of 3 weeks as a super solar funded international collaborator, and we've been going down to Diamond Light Source and doing some X-ray scattering, surprise surprise, of perovskite materials. She's previously worked in industry, both for the Swedish equivalent of the National Grid and also for an optics company making filters and gratings. So we've got quite a wide breadth of experience in different areas. So I'm going to stop wittering on and hand over to Malin and let you tell you something about metal halide perovskite solar cells across multiple length scales. So over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan, for a very nice introduction, and thank you for coming today to listen to this presentation. So I come from Uppsala, as Alan said, and I'm going to talk about perovskites, both macro projects and small into details nano projects. So I'm working in Department of Chemistry, and the part is physical chemistry, which has historically been strong in artificial photosynthesis and time-resolved measurements, light measurement, laser spectroscopy, and also been strong in solar cells, in particularly dye-synthesized solar cells historically, and then also zinc solar cells, and then now later on perovskite solar cells. So one reason why we do this research is to lower the carbon footprint, and here you see some of the sustainable development goals, which many times been mentioned, and solar cells, hopefully somewhere here. So these, we try to get some clean energy, and also due to the situation with global warming and so on, trying to reduce that. And also when it comes to perovskites, in all techniques, it's of course important with the production, how is it done, the recycling and the material, the encapsulation and everything around that is also important. So I will mix a little bit basic fundamental things and also the research. So a solar cell, what is that? It's a semiconductor which converts directly light into electrical energy. So it's a direct conversion from light. And it's the photovoltaic effect. So usually a semiconductor being excited to conduction band, and then you can take use of the charges, the electrons and holes that is created in the semiconductor, and drive a current. So perovskite materials, they are these metal halide perovskites. They are produced from solution, and they crystallizes at low temperature. So it's a low temperature processing, around 100 degrees, 150 degrees. And here you see one of the simplest structures. So here we have methyl ammonium iodide and lead iodide, and that has created, and the perovskite structure is this methyl ammonium lead iodide, and it's the formula ABX3. So perovskite, name perovskite, is actually the structure of it, and it contains of lead particles, ion atoms, here the gray ones, which is the small cation, and then they are surrounded by anions, the iodide here, and then we have the methyl ammonium ion in the middle of the structure. So it sits in the interstitials of this kind of cubic or tetragonal faced structure. Why this material is so interesting is many things. It is absorbing light, have a highly absorbing, so it has a large absorption coefficient. It absorbs a lot of light. It take use of a lot of light. And then also the transport of the hole and the electrons is easy. So it has the charge carriers is transported easy in the material. So it's highly crystalline, even though we are using low temperature. So it crystallizes, it's very organized. If you compare that to silicon solar cells, for instance, where you have high temperature processing. So, so here you see an example of light coming in, going through transparent layers, and here you have the absorption in the perovskite layer, and there is the charge separation of the hole and the electrons. We will continue with that later on. So this is a cross-section of a typical NIP junction, the most classical single junction solar cell. So here you see this is the electron conductive materials. First we have a transparent glass, transparent fluor doped tin oxide. Then in this case there is TiO2, titanium dioxide, and a mesoporous titanium dioxide layer, then the perovskite, then the whole transport material. Many times material that is used is spiral, which transport the holes, and then in this case here is some gold. So this is how a solar cell is built up. They can also be called inverted, so PIN instead. Then we have simply described the whole transport material is the first layer that goes is deposited on the conductive glass, and then the perovskite, then the electron conductive layer, and then a metallic contact. In many times silver in this case when you have the inverted structure. And inverted, you will hear about inverted, both the normal structured and the inverted later on. And why many people are working on inverted structures is because they can be used as a top layer in a tandem solar cell device. So for instance, having the silicon solar cell, and above you put the perovskite layer. So one other property which is unusual for semiconductors is that you can vary the band gap so much as you can in the perovskite structure. So you can exchange ions, the X here, to, for instance, bromide, and then you make the band gap broader. You absorb wavelengths that is shorter. Or you can change the A to other ions like cesium to stabilize the structure. Fa is also stabilizing the structure more. So in this way you can vary your band gap and the efficiency of your solar cell to what purposes you are going to have use them in. So for instance, if you want to have them indoors, maybe you should have a shorter band gap. If you're going to have them outside, maybe broader. In tandem solar cell, a broader band gap. So this is a positive thing with the perovskite structure as well. So here is a very simple explanation of the tandem solar cell devices. If you want to compete with other techniques like silicon solar cells, silicon solar cell is already established. There is an industry, even though it's an industry which actually uses a lot of energy because of this high temperature and low vacuum technologies, which is not needed in the perovskite structure. It's still established and it's there. But to compete with that, maybe a possibility is to do tandem solar cell devices. And here you see a two-terminal version. So then the first layer here is the perovskite layer. It has a wider band gap, so it's in this wavelength range from maybe 300 over to around 800, and then below is the silicon solar cell device. And this is called two-terminal when you have one contact there and one contact there, and you measure over the whole solar cell. There is also, they can be called four-terminal solar cell. Then you just place two solar cells above each other. So then you also have a contact here and a contact here. That is the four-terminal solar cell device, which is also a possibility to work on and develop. And another reason for the interest of perovskite solar cell is the increase in efficiency in very short time. So it's a rather steep curve here. If you look at the yellow-red curve here, so this is the NREL solar efficiency chart, which many people show now and then. And this is kind of the competition of the world also. Who is having the record right now and who have it and so on. So it's South Korea still that have the record. But why I show this is also that it has the efficiency is now higher than the SIG solar cell and many other thin film technologies. So that's why we work on it. So here is a map of Sweden, and why I took this slide from a presentation that I had long ago, and that was when different young researchers were going to describe we had presentations, and you showed a worldwide map where you have been and so on, where you have done your PhD, your postdoc and so on. I have not traveled that much, so I have stayed here in Uppsala during my whole PhD, during my postdoc, and during my research after that. And the reason is because my family don't want to move, so we stay there. But why I show it also is because how it's connected to energy. So the energy that we have in Sweden is we have a lot of rivers here, broad rivers where we have hydropower. Then we have 3 nuclear plants, and then we have some wind power and some solar cells. So we don't have that much fossil fuels, but we have so our largest exhaustion of carbon dioxide come from transport. That is the transport sector. So trucks that is driving up and down the country. And yeah, why I showed this was also that I'm born here on a small island, and I learned very early on to navigate between reefs and sandbanks, which is there. And because my father was a fisherman, and I helped him with that. And to navigate is usually a good thing to learn when it comes to research or working in academia. There was one that did not succeed in navigation that well. It's the Russian submarine in 1981 that stranded on one of those reefs. And now, you know, connected to energy is this pipes that is going, the Nord Stream. I don't know if you have heard about them. That have, there is a, we can call it a leakage maybe, and it's around here, close to Bornholm, that belongs to Denmark. So there is leakage on both this pipe number 2 and pipe number 1. And the exhaustion of carbon dioxide there is approximately, now it's like 40% of the whole fossil fuel exhaustion from Sweden, which is just going up to the air. And yeah, this is a rather damp and cold area, but in the summertime it can be nice. So now I come to the first project, which is large scale. This is macro project. And I'm just a small part of this big project, but it gives me funding to continue my research. And it's also interesting, of course. And I talked about this fossil fuel consumption, which is connected to transport. So in this project, there are many companies involved. It's Scania, which is a truck company. Then it's a solar cell company called Midsummer that has their development in Sweden and some of the production in China. Then there is an energy company and a small truck companies. The project leader for this project is Malin Johansson. And I talked to him yesterday because I also wanted him to water my plant that is in my office in Sweden. And then he said, because of the release that is rather soon, I'm not allowed to show, because when we do this kind of big projects, we are not the bosses, even though it looks like that. The Uppsala University is not the bosses, these are the bosses. So we are not allowed to show anything around it, or actually which has been previously on the net is like the setup of solar cells on the truck. But what I can describe at least is that this project first started with that we put a small solar cell with a logger with some sensors to measure wind and light on the solar cell, on the truck, a small solar cell one. And that old truck traveled around in Sweden and measured data. We got data on that. And then from Uppsala University there is also groups of electronics and doing calculations of this and also making graphs and see how much would we earn and how would it be to have this. Yes, another thing also, if we convert, so now many people in Sweden having battery cars instead, and that makes a problem to the net. And right now we are also selling a lot of electricity to Germany, for instance, because of the situation with the gas and so on. So our net is not so stable anymore. And if all trucks would convert to batteries that needs to be charged here and there, the net doesn't survive that actually. Then we have to think about other energy sources to improve our the stability of the grid. So that's why we thought about this project, to have how much would we earn with the solar cells, and it gave me also some bullet points here about the project. So we have, after we had this little small solar cell on the truck, Erik bought a Scania truck that they built in Scania, and then we put on solar cells. So in the end of the spring, all solar cells were in place on the truck, so on the roof and on the sides. Approximately 150 square meters of solar cells. And this is to kind of help the grid, and we want to see how much can we give to the grid, how much do we need to charge, and so on. So that is also future. So as you see here, so what we still have left is this energy company Dalakraft helped us with this. That is to develop a solution to connect the solar cell and battery to the grid, the combination of having battery and solar cell, and how you solve that. So that is still left. What is needed into this project, and what we also have collaboration is the automatic control engineering, but that is more or less done now. The electricity, electronics and batteries, but here is also an area which I think is rather easy to get job in the future. If you are interested in those things, like control engineering and so on, there is a lot of people needed. As well, I hope, in solar cells. So this project is financed by, it's called Vinnova, the ones that is financing us. And my small part here is to investigate how you can upscale the perovskite. I, of course, course, collaborate also with the company Midsummer, and we talk about different solutions. So at Midsummer, they mainly do sputtering processes and large scale thin film processes. But what I have done so far, and what was Erik's suggestions, was to, so this is the substrates that I get from Midsummer. So they are 15 times 15 centimeters. I've been testing out to do 10 times 10 and 8 times 10 perovskite layers. So larger area than we usually do in our lab. And here, one of the first steps was to do a kind of half solar cell. So this is an inverted solar cell. So as a whole transport material, we have this 2-pack molecule, which is this phosphonic acid with the carbazole group here. So that is used as the first layer, and then we try to see how good is the wetting properties. So what we tried here is spin coating. So it is, of course, an enormous actually substrate to spin coat, and with the centripetal force we have a little bit different thicknesses over the surface from the middle and if we look out on the edges there. But the variation in thickness is not that big, and that it can't be used, at least. Another upscaling technique that we have been working with is slot die coating. So then you have a slot head. So this is the equipment. This is how it looks like. And we have placed the equipment in a fume hood. It would have been better, of course, to have it in a glove box, but it makes it more complicated. And we want to also make the process easy, that we can easily work on it, but still, of course, with all the safety for us, so we are not getting any problems by working. So with a good flow here, which of course also can affect the surface when the liquid is crystallizing. So that is a balance that we have worked on. But this is an example of perovskite, the simplest one, perovskite, on FTO glass, fluor-doped tin oxide glass, and TiO2 blocking layer in this case. So it works too, but there are differences which don't necessarily have to be bad, but they look very different if you look, for instance, in scanning electron microscopy. So this is SEM images of the surface. So here you have the spin coated. This is usually what you see when you look at the spin coated film. Small grades, or comparably small. Also observe the scale bar here and the difference in scale bar. But here you have a much larger crystals that has been growing out like flowers. And first we thought, like, oh, this doesn't look good. This might not work as a solar cell, but actually it worked really well. So the conductivity was good. The problems was hysteresis effect and other types of effects, which I will show, I think, later on. And we also saw it started to come publications. So this was around. Yeah, so we published a paper in 2020, but here we found a rather old paper of also a large-scale deposition technique, but it was not slot die coating, I don't remember which one it was, which had rather simple, it looked rather similar to what we saw. So even though it looks very strange, you can get a rather good efficiency, but you also get much more inhomogeneous surface. And that inhomogeneous surface is one of the reasons why we get these hysteresis effects, which I will talk about later on. And above here you see a cross-section of one of our slot die coated samples. So even if the thickness is too, we can say that it's too thick usually for a functional perovskite solar cell. It's usually maybe more around 400 nanometers, around that. Even though it's so thick, it works rather well. And we also see that the crystals looks rather nice here in the film. So they are big, which means that you don't have that much interfaces where the electrons and holes has to go through. and instead you had a rather easy transport in the material. And now we slowly go into more of my interest. So this will be an introduction, we can say, in one way. So now I've talked a little bit about slot die coating, and also a little bit about spin coating, the differences in that, how it looks like on the crystal face. What I also look at is this homogeneous growth nucleation in different alcohols, which, so here the crystallization occur already in the solution, while as in these techniques you have the crystallization comes when you heat your substrates. So, and here you also see examples of different solvents that is normally used in solar cell production. So DMF is rather toxic, you want to avoid that, but it's still there in many cases. And then we try to go over to DMSO instead, which is less toxic, but not, it's still a little bit toxic. For instance, this DMSO is used to transport atoms from the outside to the inside of the skin. So on horses, for instance, when they treat them with medicine, they put it on the legs with DMSO, and it goes into the body, the medicine. So there we have to be careful when we work with that and have lead iodide, for instance. So even though DMSO in itself is not so toxic, it can cause things that is toxic. So now we saw the different nucleation, and that is connected to the temperature also, how we heat those samples. So when we use the spin coating technique, we spin coat our sample, and we have a substrate, we have our solution, we spin coat it, and then we put it on a hot plate. So we have a room temperature substrate that we put on a hot plate. So we have a slow crystallization. And when we do slot die coating, in our case at least, we heat our substrate before we put our solution on through the slot. And that is also to avoid, because we are working in a fume hood and not in a glove box, to avoid humidity, which is one factor that we have to be careful about when we work with perovskite. It's sensitive to humidity. So the temperature here, as you can see, here we have the nucleation rate. Here we have the growth rate of crystals. So this goes back to classical nucleation theory. And then we have our phase transition. So from liquid to solid is somewhere there in between. So if you have a low temperature, you have more nucleus. That's why you have smaller grains. While as at high temperatures, you have more of a crystal growth than actually the nucleation. So that's why you also see these differences in the grains. One other basic, which everybody knows that work with solar cells, but if you don't work with solar cells, it's like comparing it when I look at people showing me efficiency of batteries. It takes time to understand what you actually see. But when you work with solar cells, you always do this. JV curve. This is a way for us to measure the efficiency of the solar cell. So what we do then, so what you see here in the graph is the current density as a function of the voltage. We step our voltage and we measure how much current do I get out of the solar cell. And then the curve can look differently. This is an example of how the curve can look like. And this is the open circuit voltage, the value of that. Here is the short circuit current. And here we have the maximum power point. So the shape of the curve is also telling us how efficient our solar cell is. So another value here which is important and which is almost always mentioned in if you work with solar cells is the fill factor. So as you can see, fill factor is a percentage or a ratio between the maximum power point, current and voltage taken from this value here, and then the open circuit voltage and short this is also giving us the value, how efficient, or how much resistance do I have in my solar cell. And here you see the equation for the actual efficiency. So this is the power from the sun compared. So this is the power from the solar cell divided by the power from the sun. So this is the value. Why I wanted to introduce that is also because you will see some slides later on with different IV curves, and then you know if they are good or not. So also, so how the curve looks like can also give us an information of what kind of resistance do I have in my solar cell. Is there not functional thin film layers? So is there some serial resistance that I have in my solar cell, or do I have any shunt resistance? So we want to have as low serial resistance as possible, but as high shunt resistance as possible to have as good functional solar cell as possible. Because if this one is low, it means that if the shunt resistance is low, it means that current are sneaking around from the layers. It don't go through the layers. It maybe there is a hole in one layer, and then you have some current that goes through those. So it's connected to the efficiency of the solar cell as well. Further on, so we are still a little bit into the larger scale ideas to get larger solar cells. So here we see what I wanted to investigate is sputtered indium doped tin oxide. If that can be used as a, it can already be used as an electron conductive layer, but could it also be used as a conductive layer in between later on in the solar cell? But right now, what you see here is a classical NIP junction. So here we have the electron conductive layer perovskite, still a perovskite 2D layer to avoid humidity, which increase the efficiency a little bit, and then we have our spiral, and then we want to put our sputtered indium tin oxide in that. That was the first test. Here we see example of evaporated, classical evaporated gold on top. And here we have an efficiency approximately 20%, while as this sputtered version. And now you see, you can understand on the curve and the meaning on the curve that is not that good with sputtered idea. But of course, the relevant can be done, and they can get better values. But this was one of the first tests with to sputter ITO. Another thing we have looked at is atomic layer deposition of tin oxide. So here we have tested different temperature and how that affect in the technique of atomic layer deposition. What happens with the thickness if you increase the temperature during your evaporation or deposition? And we don't need to look at all the curves here, but we can take a look at the last three, these ones. So here you see different temperatures. We have tried to keep the thickness constant, and then this is how many cycles is needed when you, so here is like atom layer by atom layer to increase the thickness. So you make it many times, like circles like this. And then you get the thickness in the end. As you can see, even though the thickness is the same, we have a very different band gap. I have maybe not talked about the band gap so much, but you see the alpha here is the absorption cost. So here we have low absorption, and then when the absorption goes up, that means there is the band gap. So this is a broad banded electron conductor. So a big variation in band gap, just because of how you deposit the layers. And of course we want the band gaps to fit to our material. So So there is an easy electron charge. The current goes easily from the perovskite layer to the electron conductor layer, just as well as we want the holes to be easily transported in a simple way in the material. So not too big gaps, because if it is that, then we have recombination instead in the solar cell. So this is solar cell deposited by slot die coating with the atomic layer deposited tin oxide. So now we have this large upscaled technique, or semi-upscaled slot die coating, and then with the electron. So what you see here is the efficiency is not so good. We have a good current. Our current is good, I would say, but the voltage is also rather low, but not super low. And you also see that the curve is not perfect here. And we have hysteresis. And what hysteresis is like is if you are ramping the voltage in one direction, you measure your curve, and then you go from a high value voltage, and then you go back, and then you plot those curves, and you look at that. So it's actually just how you drive the current. If you go from a high voltage value to low, or if you go from a low voltage to a high voltage, and the differences in these two curves. So here is still possibilities to develop the material. So now we'll go even more into the interest, what I think is fun, and that is fractal patterns. So we can take a deep breath, so we don't fall asleep, and we go in more into small particles now. So here you see different versions of classical fractal patterns. This is also fractal patterns, but not so common. So fractal is when you see one little quantity that is repeat themselves in larger and larger amounts. Now we go back to the homogeneously growth perovskite crystals. They grow directly in the alcohol solution. So immediately when you mix the different components, you get a black solution instead of having this bright yellow solution that you otherwise have, a perfectly dissolved solution which you deposit. Here it becomes black directly, and you form crystals immediately in the solution. So we mix components and we get perovskites. And here is the SEM image of how the perovskite grains can look like. As you can see, they have very deviation in size, but they seem to be rather organized. They are rather sharp in the edges. The cubes or the cuboidal grains are rather well organized. And this is how the solution looks like, and if we spin coat that type of solution, it looks like this. It's a very porous, diffuse layer. But when I started with this project rather long ago, I also started to learn how to use transmission electron microscopy. And I was new, but I got an old teacher that taught me how to do this, and everything was kind of new. How should I mix, and how should I put my solution on in the substrate? And in this case, we are using copper grid as substrates, tiny small substrates that we put into the transmission electron microscopy, and then we look at it. Then I saw this as an example, as one of my first tries with transmission electron. And what you see here is this kind of dendrite growth, almost like we saw in the snowflake. Then we have this hexagon growing into arms. At least this is always how a snowflake look like, but you know all snowflakes look different. But we have these always these 6 arms. So the dendrites, the arms that is growing out, is mirroring the crystal structure that you have. So the water molecules, form this hexagon. We have the angle there, and it changes a little bit when it crystallizes. That's why it becomes a hexagon when they go together. And here is the same thing. We know that our material is cubic or tetragonal. So the angles in these arms is always 90 degrees. And I thought that was fascinating fascinating to see, but it didn't give so many result as for solar cell production, but I thought it was interesting. What I also were able to observe in my first test was because of the energy of the when you measure the electrons, so transmission electron microscopy, you have electrons there, the energy you get from the actual measurement is actually creating effects when you look at it. So I could see how particles went together and formed larger crystals, and then they continuously were forming, and they usually, this is an example what I saw. So here you actually see a quantum dot. So in our solar cell group we are also working with quantum dots, and this is an example of icosahedron, 5-folded symmetry, and the 5-folded symmetry is also almost close by quasi-particles, where you usually also have this 5-folded symmetry. So they give also a nice electron diffraction pattern. But I could also see other types of grains. And here is also an example of how I could watch at the atomic layers and those small particles, how they went together, how they wanted to organize. And this was one of my fundamental questions also, and still is, and why I have collaboration with Alan, is how do they grow, how do they form, and why do they form as they do. And usually when I were sitting there in the microscopy, the end product, when it didn't form anything more or change anymore, was something like this. And when I used this particle, I could actually, which I will not show today, but I could calculate, so the coastline here can be compared to the British Isles or so, where they also use fractal calculations to understand the coastline. So I also did that for different types of clusters, or what we can call it. And I could see that there were actually fractals, these particles. But this is how it looks like in SEM. So then we are in scanning electron microscopy, again, larger scales. I could also see with different techniques that they had a very porous structure. So the porosity of the crystals can also be useful, maybe not a solar cell, but if we think about other interactions where you want to have a large surface. And because of the good conductivity in the material and so on, maybe the properties can be used in other techniques as well. This was also in the beginning of my, when I started with transmission electron microscopy. Here I tried to see how, at what distance is the atomic layers in the structure, and I try to understand how they were formed. And now I will sometimes use this expression. So this is a molar ratio between the MAI solution, we can call it, or MAI, the methylammonium iodide, and the lead iodide. So I wanted to compare different concentration of those two. If you fail, for instance, when you're scaling your amount, if you have a little bit deviation, what is happening? But here I had rather large steps. So now we are watching X-ray diffraction, and X-ray diffraction is how you can quantify your crystals. A peak in, some of you know all this, but just to repeat that the peaks here is giving you information about your crystallinity of your material. What kind of plane do I have, and what can I define from this? So here I'm still working with MAPI, this simple and most classical version, and here I have measured with different XRD machines. So this black line here is grazing incident XRD, and in our lab, our grazing incident XRD has not that high resolution, as you can see. If I would measure this material with the machine, I would just see that, okay, it's cubic, more or less. It's just one peak. But if you have other types of characterization techniques or diffraction measurements. So this is from powder XRD instead. So after you have seen in the SEM the powders, then you get a higher resolution and you can actually see these double peaks forming. But even if you have this double peak, so if you have a double peak, that means tetragonal phase, single peak, cubic phase. But I could also see that it varied between cubic and tetragonal phase. So here is 1-to-1 is equal amounts. You have a stoichiometric film, but 2-to-1 more MAI, and here we have more lead iodide instead. I was also looking at another solvent, terpenol, which, at that time I thought that maybe that could be good to deposit actually those grains over a surface. It was not so good actually in the end, so that's it. And these are the planes that you see here in the XRD pattern. Okay, I thought that I would not have enough time, but now I see that I actually, but here you see transmittance, reflectance, that is easy to understand. How much is the material transmitting, how much is it reflecting? And it's actually not transmitting so much, but you see this line, this is the band gap. And what is a little bit unusual for this material is also that you have a very sharp band gap when you do the perovskite directly in solution. Very, very organized. Now I continue. So now I from the transmittance and reflectance, I calculate the absorption coefficient. And here I have plotted the absorption coefficient instead. And what is otherwise common in the perovskite is that you have a little bit of tail, not super much, but a little tail. This tail is usually localized states in the band gap, because otherwise, if you go from here, for instance, you measure long wavelengths, and then suddenly you have this high absorption. That is where the electrons is going from the valence band to the conduction band. Here is the band gap. So it's rather easy to, you can model that in different ways and look at how is my band gap, but approximately the band gap in this material is 1.55, which is also actually a little bit more suitable for a single junction solar cell. Otherwise it's usually shifted a little bit. Here we have photoluminescence emission. That is when you excite the electrons to the conduction band, and then you look at how when they recombine, what kind of energy curve does it look like. So the photoluminescence emission can be compared with the band gap and the position of the band gaps. And there you can also see if you have, is it a little bit shifted, maybe you have excitons in your material and so on. So, but here you can also see the intensity of the different peaks vary a lot. So here we see that the highest intensity of this emission, and the intensity in photoluminescence emission gives you an information of how good is my how good is this material. If you have put it on a glass or something, so the electrons are not going further into another material, there is no quenching, as it's called. This emission peak and the intensity of that is also giving you information of how good is your material, one can say. And here you actually see that the one that has more MAI in the solution were the one that functioned best. But here there is not that much different. The band gap is still sitting at the same place. I can just say that this is a comparison what you usually see in absorbance. This is a classical thin film of perovskite, and here is the material, the homogeneously growth material band gap. I think like just mentioned, tetragonal phase, cubic phase, FAPBI3 for instance, cubic alpha phase. But when you work with FA, you also have to be careful because at lower temperature it creates this delta phase instead. So then you have to look for the delta phase. Delta phase is yellow, still a crystalline structure, but with a much broader band gap. My fundamental questions was also how do they form? So here is scanning transmission, electron microscopy, which you can do in the same instrument sometimes, in my case at least. And here I managed to see a little bit of this, how it were forming. So this was another version of how it could form crystal. When I zoomed in on those crystals, I looked even closer. And here you maybe don't see that here, but yeah, I can leave a bit the atoms, how they are arranged, and you can try to investigate them even more. So I thought it was just fun to see this. Then of course you can apply different models to this to understand what it is. And other thing that I found in those solutions was that the molar residue concentration between the components were important for the growth. So for instance, if there were a lack of MAI, you also got these truncated cuboid systems. You have different planes which it's growing in. While if you have a large quantity of MAI around, it prefers to grow into those cubes. Here I compared 1 week old solution and a new solution. This is also something that we continuously look on. How does it form, and what is happening during the time here? There is other people also working on that. Here was also a comparison between a new suspension and a 1 week old suspension, and this is photoluminescence mapping of the crystals. And we could also see that the peak position and the intensity, so here you can see the intensity in photoluminescence emission varied a lot also. So the longest and shortest and highest and lowest is plotted here of the peaks. So when you scan over those different grains, depending on which crystal plane you have and how the crystals look like, the peak position can vary and your intensity. So in other words, and this is something that many other researchers also do, is like see how is the functionality of these different particles. And maybe you can organize that. Yeah. So I think I need to stop here. I just do a fast flash through different results. This is lead iodide seen in 10. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Really interesting talk. We've got time for one or two quick questions. Any questions from the audience?
Yes?
John?
So the performance on your NREL diagram for these materials is equivalent to silicon, pretty much.
Yes.
So when will we have commercial versions of these materials, or are there commercial versions of these materials?
There are a few companies that is kind of on the way to commercialize, and there is one in Oxford, for instance, a company. There is a company in Poland, Seoul or something they are called. There is also one company outside Uppsala, Molar. They try to sell the whole production line actually for the perovskite. So they might arrive. The problem I think is the lead here also. And I don't like, of course I would like to have another atom there than the lead. But yeah. So when? I don't know. What do you think, Alan?
Yeah, so every time you go to a perovskite conference, they started off saying in 10 years' time, and then it's 5 years' time, and now it's currently in 1 or 2 years' time. So it is getting closer, but not there yet. I mean, there's a lot of companies have put a lot of money and time and effort into it, but not quite there yet. Yeah, Tony?
I mean, isn't it the situation that the polycrystalline silicon manufacturers operate an Edisonian policy? And so they're going to make a loss in the short term and let another technology get a foothold.
Yeah. Yeah, they've already established silicon production of solar cells.
So Oxford PV, for example, are pushing really hard to work with silicon and that's why they think that going down the tandem route will get them in the back door by working with silicon as opposed to trying to compete directly. And these materials lend themselves really well to that because of the tunability. Any other questions? I just had one quick one on the I think it was the ALD or the tin oxide. You had different temperatures, you got very different band gaps.
Yes.
What's changing to change the band gap? Presumably the material is reasonably similar.
Yeah, it can be maybe that, I don't know how well the stoichiometry has been measured there, it was. And they call it just, yeah, so. Yes, this is also a thing that in ALD production, it's almost something like in between amorphous and crystalline phase. And in a collaboration with another group, we also try to, because even though you say amorphous, then it's not crystalline, but even if it is amorphous, you can have like organized this, yeah. So that could maybe affect the band gap also.
Okay, thank you. If there aren't any more questions from the floor, then we'll thank our speaker once again. Thank you very much. Thank you for your attention. Pretty good.
Before you close it down, would you mind if I took a photo of you both?
Yeah.
Maybe with the first
Yeah.
slide,
Yeah, why not?
just for blogs and if that's okay.
Yes, yes.
No problem if not. Yeah, that would be great. Thank you. I'll just take a quick.
Okay. Keep it back a bit. I join you.
Yeah. If that, are all the people coming to lunch here?
Yeah, so these,
Yeah.
do you want to join us? Just take a
Just a quick picture.
Oh, okay.
I'll give you no pressure if you don't want to do it. We're doing
blog,
so I just thought I'd take
The series of talks, basically.
It's highly unlikely that podcast is going to
So how do I know actually if it's
chop it open and see the fibers.
and I have this I'll show you.
You can smash it to bits and see the fibers. No, you're right.
Perovskite.